welcome to RICO 12. I'm excited this week. We pre-recorded a special meeting with Sid K, who was a previous guest on RICO 12. And in this recording, Sid goes through and really does a deep dive into the history of early AA, what is commonly known as the flying blind period. It's the period between 1935 and 1939. Now, 1939 is when the big book came out. It's when the 12 steps were kind of made public and everything. So Sid goes into a deep dive in that 4-year period and digs really well into where the 12 steps came from, where AA came from, the sources, including the Oxford group and a whole lot of sources within that. Now, if you're listening to this in podcast format on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may listen to on your podcasts, I would recommend that you go check us out on YouTube, and the link to that would be in the show notes here. This is a presentation. Sid does a PowerPoint presentation with lots of resources, lots of additional information that is just as well. It's actually better watched than just listened to. You can actually see things, maybe take some notes based on visuals, and enjoy it. But it's up on YouTube here, and you can go and watch it there. Now, let me just introduce myself a little bit here. My name is Justin. I am a recovering addict. Date of sobriety is June 19th, 2015. I'm the host of the RICO 12 Speaker Meeting podcast, and this is the 129th meeting of RICO 12. Now, we're doing things a little bit differently during this next month and a half, where we aren't doing the live speaker meetings. And this is the second of those weeks that will be done this way. I'm taking this time with family and enjoying my Fridays with them, but we will be back the week of January 6th, the first week of 2023, back to live sessions, and it's already booked out into May. So we've got live speaker meetings booked every Friday at noon Central Time, starting January 6th through May. And if you want to get in and be a speaker later on in the year, I'd be happy to make that happen. Anyways, let's jump into Sid's stuff here. I will read a little bit about him, and then we will get started with this recording. Okay, so here's a little bit about Sid. Sid was also a previous guest on RICO 12 on meeting number 107, in which he spoke on living a surrendered life. Now, here's his bio. Sid is a grateful, recovered addict living in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was brought into recovery from drug and alcohol addiction in 2015 at the age of 18 and has since sought to bring God into every area of his life to live happily and usefully whole, free from all addiction. He is also the founder of the Pioneer Program Research Group, which seeks to conduct unbiased, fact-based research into the program of action undertaken by the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous from 1935 through 1939. Their mission is to conduct and share this research, making it free and accessible for all, in hopes that they may one day better see and pass along an authentic representation of how the pioneers practiced their recovery program. And really, this presentation is deep into that. So I'm really excited here to turn this over to Sid. And we have a little bit of Q&A during this process, but really this is a presentation on that history, that early 1935 through 1939 time period. So here we go. Excited to get this going.
Hey everybody, my name is Sid. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you, Justin, for having me on to give this presentation. I do just want to say I'm not an AA archivist or archivist for any 12-step fellowship. I'm not in any authority position, and I'm not I don't represent any AA history in any official way. I wouldn't say I'm a historian. I would just say I really am interested in 12-step history and wanting to share that and make that available to other people. And because of that, about a year ago, I started a group called the Pioneer Program Research Group, and we've been looking into researching and making available history of early AA there's plenty of great literature. There's plenty of wonderful stuff already there, but it's been our goal to kind of look specifically at the first 4 years of AA from 35 to 39. And and that's what AA calls the flying blind period. And so that's what this presentation will talk about. It's yeah, uncovering the flying blind period. And we're going to be looking, a lot of history presentations will often be a lot of events and things taking place of people meeting people, those kind of things. What we're going to focus on here is specifically practices in early AA, because there's plenty of information that you can find in AA literature as well as other literature that AA historians have written to see what happened when it happened. And so this will focus specifically on early AA practices and where they came from. All right, so the first thing, since it's a history presentation, I want to set some best practices about AA history. And one is, don't believe everything you hear or read, including this presentation. And that's why I've included references to each of the sources that I pull from on each slide. So you can go and check it for yourself. Um, yeah, and number two is, we're never going to uncover history entirely. We're never going to know exactly what happened because we're not there, and it was passed down. We might hear it from someone who was, two people away, or even if we hear it directly from one person, it's still their memory of what happened. And so what we can try to do is get as close to the person that it happened to, and as early in, as close to the date that it happened. But for example, some things like Bill started spreading the 6-step AA myth, and that started in the early 50s, and there's no documentation before that supporting that at all. And yeah, Bill Schauberg shared about that really well in his book, The Writing of the Big Book. So that's just one thing, is that we can only hope to get as close as we can. The other thing is that Bill never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And this is unfortunately the shortcoming in some of the AA history books, is that a lot of it has to do with what Bill remembered or what Bill thought it would be better to say. And they're specific, it's always going to come back to memory. Like there's a lot of controversy around Dr. Bob's sobriety date, which he states as June 10th, but that's also the same day that the AMA convention started. So the accounts that he came back from the convention on that Thursday following that Monday and then got sober would place his sobriety date later. And so we don't know. Look, there maybe have been a pre-conference, or maybe that's the 1 year that the AMA got their dates, wrong and recorded them wrong. So because of that and these other things, we want to seek double attestation. It's, do you see the same information in 2 or more different sources? And so not Bill said it here once and Bill said it here once. It's 2 or more separate people, particularly, and that at least helps us get more objective with the truth instead of relying specifically on one person's memory. The last thing I'll say is to always understand the source's agenda and how they can proof text the material. And what I mean by that is that I can say that, I can make up a claim that in early AA they did this, and I can pull 3 words from the big book to show you that they did that. And that doesn't mean that that's what they did, and I might have an agenda. So I'll just share some different, like, because this research has been come at from a lot of different angles. Like Wally P, he did the back to basics research, and that was focusing on the beginners class formats that started in the early 1940s. So that does not cover the time range or personal sponsorship that our work has. Dick B, his research focus only on really Oxford group practices in early AA. At least from what I've read, I haven't read all 40 of his books, but that was his main focus. There's Came to Believe Recovery, which focuses on the step-taking retreats that Clarence Snyder, the founder of AA in Cleveland, did later into his life. And they also say that this is how early AAs did it. So here we have 3 different people saying 3 different ways on how it was in early AA. And then, yeah, Bill Shaverk, his research focuses primarily on the writing of the big writing of the big book, including the steps, but he doesn't dive into common practices of early AA or their Oxford group roots. And I got to be at a presentation he gave a couple months ago and was able to ask him the question of, like, what about the similarities we see in this Oxford group practice? And he said, that his research did not focus on that, it wasn't his primary interest. So he has wonderful scholarship, just not on this topic. And then there's Father Bill W. and Glenn C. have both done wonderful work on the Oxford group roots of early AA. We just want to also look at, when I said their agenda, right, is so Wally P., Dick B., and Came to Believe Recovery all argue for the resurgence, or the how it's beneficial to practice the practices and the sponsorship that they describe, and it all focuses on the claim that they had better success, and that we've had a decline in success rate. That is also a myth that's been debunked as of 2008. And I didn't know that until a year ago when I read the paper um, on that from, I think it was Glenn C was in it, and then I think Arthur S. But there's a really good paper on it, and you can just look up recovery rate myths 2008, and you'll be able to find that.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I had not heard of that either. So there's a paper from 2008 that debunks that, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So what they did is they looked at the AA membership surveys in 2007, and that survey is where, and I actually have some details from that survey in a couple slides, but that survey is often misquoted and misrepresented in how that data is presented, to argue that there is only a 5% success rate in AA today. And what the data is actually saying in that survey is that 5% of the 13,000 people we surveyed have only been in AA for 1 month. So it's not, yeah, it's saying
I
two
gotcha.
totally different things, but it can be easily misrepresented.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. So what I've been doing, my methodology and my research is to uncover these common practices in early AA. And to do that, I need to go back, and what we've done as a group is to cross-reference the Oxford group material and to find out what was the Oxford group really doing, which is different than what does AA history material say the Oxford group was doing. We also want to cross-reference early AA instructional material. We have the big book that was published in 1939, but we have plenty of pamphlets out of Akron in the 40s, the earliest in 1942. We have the sponsorship pamphlet out of Cleveland. We have the table mate. We have the little red book. There's plenty of material that details what was going on, and it was different in each location. It was not exactly the same everywhere, and so it's helpful to cross-reference the locations and the dates to see what were the practices at those times. And then the last part is cross-referencing early AA stories. Now, sometimes there is an issue, and I'll share in the presentation here. I have a first edition draft of the story for my Southern friend, and or our Southern friend. And this first edition draft is called John. I think it's called John and I, referring to John Barleycorn, and his telling of what happened and how he was introduced to this way of life is entirely different in the first edition than it is in the edition that's published in our big books today, or the one that even made it into the first edition of the big book. These stories sometimes went through as many as six edits, six editions before they were published. And so that can change a lot, over time of, oh yeah, we may have had these Oxford group practices. Maybe they did do the inventory the way that he had talked about in the story, and he just decided to mention it now that Bill had prompted him. Or maybe they didn't do the inventory, and he's just making it up and saying, well, it would sound better if I did do this, because it would be more consistent with what we want AA to be. And so that's just one footnote on that. But the good news is there's plenty of stories, and so we can look at those just with that caveat. And then by looking at all this material, we can look for common elements to see what are these things and similar that are going on over Oxford group material and early AA instructional material and early AA stories. So before I get into those practices, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the common AA myths, and some of them are related here. So the first myth is that the Oxford group has 6 steps. The second is that Oxford group had no steps. The third is that there was one word of mouth program in early AA. 4, the pioneers of AA worked the steps exactly how they are written in the big book. 5, AA has lost its recovery rate. So, and I'll just go through these pretty quickly. So the first 2, that they had no steps or they had 6 steps, well, they had multiple programs depending on what literature you look at. The 5 C's of soul surgery, 4 practical spiritual activities, the 5 procedures, and the 6 assumptions as well. We'll cover those later in the presentation. But there were no 6 steps. That myth comes from the 6 steps in the big book in Earl Treat's story. And that story was written after, I think it was written in the 50s, and it was after Bill had started the 6-step myth. And then also that there was one word of mouth program. There were multiple different versions of the word of mouth program. Bill had a different 6 steps or 4 steps, and Dr. Bob had 6. Hank Parkhurst, who helped Bill write the big book, he had 4 steps. Father Ed Dowling, he had, there's different versions. There was no universal set being followed until it was written and published in the big book in 1939. Okay, and then the pioneers of AA worked the steps exactly how they're written in the big book. So the steps were written in 1938, December 1938. Bill was unsure exactly what to write, so he postponed writing chapters 5 and 6 until those were the last 2 chapters he wrote, and that's where the majority of the steps in the big book come from in AA literature. And it's not possible that that's what they did, since that none of that was there, and it's and based on the other research that's been done, it's very unlikely that that they would have had anything. And that's a pretty clear claim that we can say, is that there were no 12 steps. There were no steps until December 1938. They were really a lot also testing out what worked and what didn't work, and they knew that there were a couple things that worked for sure from the Oxford group, and we'll talk about those too. And then AA has lost its recovery rate. This is extremely difficult to prove statistically. You can't, it's not an objective experiment of what does successful mean. What does of those who really tried our methods, 50% sobered at once, 25. So there's rates that usually go from that 50% to 70, and then we see rates like 90% and 93 in Cleveland. But there's really no way, like it wasn't an experiment that they did where we could see and what it meant. The other main thing, 2 things that I'll say, is that contemporary AA does not practice qualifying prospects the same way that was done in early AA. And what that meant is that they would, we're not throwing anybody out, whereas in early AA, you couldn't come to the program until, you couldn't come to the fellowship before the program. You had to have already, in some sources, that you should have already had made a surrender, a 3rd step or 7th-step surrender, which they didn't have those steps, but you should have made a surrender. And there's other sources that say you should have already been on your amends. So just imagine today if anybody who came into AA, was already on their amends, already had a sponsor and was already on their amends. And then we could say, oh yeah, the success, looks much different. And so
that would be quite a bit different.
yeah, definitely. And, we've opened it up a lot, and it's opened up to a lot of different fellowships as well because of that. And it's become more accessible. So, it's not I'm not here to argue for, hey, we need to go back to the way things were then, but what can we learn from what they were doing then? Okay, so here's some of those claims I was mentioning. of those different heights, 75%, 93% success rates. And here's the 2000, it's a 2007 survey. It's a 2008 paper that reports some really cool numbers. So that another indication that AA works well is shown by the fact that a total of 64% of respondents in the survey reported that 41% had stopped drinking either immediately after their first meeting or 23% within the first year. So those are really good numbers there. And then 50% of those AAs who have been sober for 3 months will continue staying sober to at least the 12-month mark is one other metric that they had there. And then we see, yeah, in that survey, and I think they sent it to 13,000 people, or that's the respondents they had. The vast majority, 45% had greater than 5 years sober, and 24% had 1 to 5 years. So the vast majority had more than 1 year sober. So there's some really good statistics that we can say empirically from that survey. All right, so now I'm going to get into the meat of the program. This is just something, the flying blind period, early AA, and we'll just call it affectionately the Pioneer Program is what I like to call it. So one way to summarize the Pioneer Program is that there were really 6 practices that we'll cover here in this presentation, but 6 main practices. One is sponsorship, and you'll see I have quotes around sponsorship because it doesn't mean what it means today. We didn't have people sitting down, meeting once a week, for an hour, to go through the steps or read a book because there was no book. It was very different. It was usually you qualify the prospect on the first visit or they're in the hospital. The second visit, you do the inventory and discussion with them, and then you teach them the AA way of life on that second visit. And very frequently between the 2 visits, they're introduced to the fellowship. And then we could summarize the rest of these 5 steps are that AA way of life that they were living. And 2, we do see a big element of fellowship, the social and spiritual camaraderie with other alcoholics. We see number 3, principled living by a set of principles. We see checking, which is checking our conduct against those principles individually, doing regular checks with others. And you'll see that the Oxford group also checked on others. They weren't checking themselves to others, they would check others. And you'll see that was one of Bill's criticisms of the Oxford group. And then the main and what early AA literature considers the most important to them was that quiet time, daily set time each morning for reading, prayer, meditation, and guidance. And guidance is just that last piece of quiet time, which is the practice the early AAs and Oxford group used of seeking God's will. And what they would do is they would write down what thoughts came to them. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through each of these 6 practices, and I'll usually start of what does Oxford group literature say about it, and what does AA literature say about it, and what information can we get from that. All right, so the first one, sponsorship, and this is where the majority of our research has focused. I'm not going to go into all the details specifically because there's plenty of research left, to do of us getting into stepping stones and getting access to all those different editions of the different drafts of stories and comparing those. And Stepping Stones is currently digitizing all their records, and that will make this research a lot easier. There's some things that we can definitely say that we've seen, and there's some things, that are still questionable. Either way, I did cover some of this in another recent presentation where I went into this specific practice in more detail. And so that presentation was more of what does early AA literature say and how were they practicing that, and less of what did the Oxford group do, which is what I'm going to share here and how that trickled down to AA. So I did share my contact email. It's aahistorynerd@gmail.com. If you want access to that presentation, I'm happy to send that to you, but this focus is a little bit different. So we'll start with the Oxford group. So, we talked about those those different myths about the Oxford group, and that, like we said, there's plenty of different things that they had, and one set formula that they had was something called the six basic assumptions, and really the the cornerstone of the Oxford group philosophy was that like sin is the problem, and to them, sin is anything that keeps us from God or from one another. So, that was the definition that the Oxford group used, and they had these six basic assumptions, and they are: men are sinners, men can be changed, confession is prerequisite to change, the changed soul has direct access to God. The age of miracles has returned, and those who have been changed must change others. So you'll see a lot of the same things as we look at these different Oxford group practices. That there's just a lot of material in common. It just goes to show you how they didn't have one set. Same as early A, there was no one set. But this is a really good explanation of where pages like 60 to 63 in the big book, where before they get into the third step, Bill is all of a sudden talking about selfishness and self-centeredness, and that's the root of our trouble. And that comes directly from the Oxford group, that sin is the root of our trouble. And we AA, we just changed that. We wanted to get away from the sin word, and so we got to selfishness and self-centeredness, or anything that's keeping us from God or from one another. And you can see I've traced the sources here, and here's where it gets tricky. As I saw these six basic assumptions and not God. I saw where he had quoted them um, from a paper from 1941, and I saw where that paper had quoted it from was another paper from 1933, which is not available online. So, the trail is ended there until that paper is available, and that's why some of this work is very difficult. Is we can only get so far. There's not digitized records from 1933, so those are the six basic assumptions. This is probably the closest thing we have to steps. The Oxford group had these four practical spiritual activities. And so this is a direct quote from the pamphlet, What is the Oxford Group? To be spiritually reborn and to live in the state in which these 4 points, and they're referring to the four absolutes, are the guides to our life in God. The Oxford group advocate four practical spiritual activities. One, the sharing of our sins and temptations with another Christian life given to God, and to use sharing as witness to help others still unchanged to recognize and acknowledge their sins. So we can see steps 4, 5, and 12 here. Two, surrender of our life, past, present, and future, into God's keeping and direction. We could see echoes of steps 3 and 7 here.
Yeah, so
Uh,
Sid, real quick
yeah.
before you jump to 3, I noticed in here the capitalization of a couple of words like sharing and witness. Is that how it was in the original book too? Capitalized these random words, and if so, is there a reason for that, do you think?
That's a good question, and I will say some of these I tried to be as exact as I could possibly, and I do believe that any word that's capitalized on here is capitalized in the book, and that book is available in PDF online if you just look up What is the Oxford Group, and this is on page 15. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where it was, but I would double check
Thank
just
you
to
so
make
much.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
but these were principles, for them. Sharing is not, sharing was a practice. It's a little bit different than what sharing would mean to someone here in, AA or in a 12-step fellowship today. So each of these four practices, actually, that pamphlet goes into depth and has a chapter on each of those. So it goes into sharing, surrender, restitution, and then guidance. Yeah, so then 3 is restitution to all whom we have wronged directly or indirectly. 4 is listening to, accepting, and relying on God's guidance and carrying it out in everything we do and say, great and small. So we can see, 8 and 9 and 3, and we can see step 11 coming from 4. But this is the closest thing we had to people actually uh, like a set of steps that a new person could take. Now, it's interesting that I can find this in Oxford group literature, but I don't see this set of four activities in any AA literature that's referring to any Oxford group practices, which is interesting because the next set, But really, yeah, actually, the five C's are in Ann Smith's journal. They appear also in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. So we do see reference to these. Now, these five C's are a little bit different than those four practical spiritual activities we just shared. One, they're an earlier material. We can source these from 1919 instead of 1933. And it's less about what the new person would do, and it's more about what would the sponsor do. And the word sponsor wasn't around the Oxford group. They might call themselves soul surgeon or life changer, things like that. And so what they would do to help change someone else, which goes back to those six basic assumptions. So here we have five steps here. Confidence, which is the establishment of rapport with the person to be changed. Confession is admission of our sins. Under guidance, we're not just telling everything, it's under guidance, the practice that we'll talk about in detail. And this quote comes from Ann Smith's journal, which is a funny quote, of, hey, just don't go share everything. Just make sure that's what God wants you to share. So admission of the soul surgeon sins to the person to be changed in order to encourage the prospect to do the same. And through that confession, right, then the prospect might open up. Now, number three is conviction. And that's where confession leading the prospect to awareness of one's sinfulness and bring the person to be changed to a decision of surrender. So this is really where you can see that, why is there such little written about step 6 and 7 in the big book, is because conviction and conversion was not something we did. It was really something that happened to us and was done to us. And so, conviction, the soul surgeon's job was to help them see how they were separated from God and their need for God. And then that would lead to a conversion where the prospect would give oneself to God. You might call this the decision or the surrender. And the last one is continuance. And this is to stay with the convert until they are changing lives of their own. So they also thought this, because this process is done in one sitting, often it could be done in more, usually at the Oxford group house parties, they would want to stay with their convert until that convert has found other converts of their own, because they knew that this was the most, discouraging part of the process, and it's the easiest place to slip. Is that you could have someone have a conversion and then slip a couple days after that. So we do know that Dr. Bob had seen this set of 5 C's. We don't know about the 6 assumptions, and we don't know about the 4 practical spiritual activities, but we do know that Ann Smith had this in her journal. And you can find the PDF scanning of that online as well. All right, and then this is the 5 procedures. It's very simple: given to God, listen to God's direction, check guidance, restitution, sharing for witness and confession. And we do find this in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, and we find this in Not God. We can't really say, did we know it's in AA literature? It's, do we know, is it a direct quote from someone in AA literature? That's something we'd have to check. And did they actually see these 5 procedures? And what's interesting is when I try to look in Oxford group literature, I had difficulty finding it. And then eventually I hit a dead end on Sam Shoemaker's book, National Awakening. I couldn't find that. So, it's quite possible it came from Sam Shoemaker. That's what we can assume, but we don't know that this was actually in any Oxford group material, which there was no official Oxford group material anyways, but Sam Shoemaker was the American head of the Oxford group, so we can trust that this was their practices. But they all kind of blend together, and they're all very similar. And so now I'll talk about early AA sponsorship. So knowing that they had access to these, we have to, I can try to apply like, hey, if we were to name these things as steps, this is what we might call them. So the first visit, which would often be done in the hospital, and you can read in the stories here, that I was in the hospital and 2 men visited me, or and there's some stories where I had 9 or 10 visitors. I had 14 or 15 visitors. And what they would do is they would go and qualify the prospect. They would find out, are you actually an alcoholic? And if you're not, then there's no reason for us to, be here, and then are you willing, to accept what we're doing? And they would leave them with the third step decision. They wouldn't, push that on them. They would leave that there and they would say, if you're interested, here's the program of action we can follow. And usually after that they were introduced into the fellowship, and they would get visits daily, right? So it wasn't the sponsee is calling the sponsor, it's that the sponsor is literally showing up to the hospital on a daily basis, or if they're out of the hospital, dropping by their home or office to check in and see how the sponsee is doing. And then the second visit would be taking steps 4 through 8 together and teaching the prospect steps 9 through 12. And then lastly, after that, it would be co-sponsoring new prospects together. So we can see that same from the Oxford group literature on continuance, is that, don't just say, hey, go sponsor people. They would go do it together. And that's why often in the stories you hear 2 men approached me, or, 2 men visited me, because it was always often 2 men together. The other thing that they would do is they would practice their quiet time together. They would work to practice the principles together, and they would check with each other. And so I'll break down these a little bit more, and I'll share specifically on each visit. And at the bottom, you'll see I have some annotations of if it's well documented or loosely documented, and if it's in instructional material or if it's in the anecdotal evidence in the stories. And so here's some steps we can break down from that first visit. Is 1, exchange drinking stories. 2 is expose illness of mind and body. And we see both of those and documented in the instructional material and in the stories, as well as the third, qualify the prospect to gain an admission of hopelessness, share your spiritual experience, discuss the God concept, and then outline the program of action. All of those are well documented in stories and instructional material. And then post step 3 decision, that's well documented in the stories, and it is documented in the instructional material, just not as much evidence yet. So that's kind of what would happen in the first visit, or what we might normally consider the sponsor is taking the sponsee through 1, 2, and leaving them with 3. And they would always leave them there. And it's interesting, if you look at the AA literature, in the big book, even in the instructions, it says, don't rush them, or else they're going to say that you rush them. Leave them there with it. Let them read the book over in the meantime before your second visit. And then even in the third step instructions in the big book, it said, we thought, long and well before taking this step, because they did. So this is just cool insight in what that early AA sponsorship looked like. And we see this documented in stories as early as 36 and as well as 37, 38, and 39. Okay, in between those first and second visits, they're being introduced to the fellowship. They're getting daily visitation by you and others. There's even one Akron pamphlet that says, just ring up, 25 to 30 calls should cinch the matter. Ring up your friends who you think will best fit for this newcomer. And then there is some other material that also shows to take them to meetings with you. And obviously that material started to come later as there were more and more meetings. So we see that in the sponsorship pamphlet, which came out in 44 from Cleveland, when they did have meetings there, whereas before we didn't see this instruction. It was more you go visit them. All right, and the second visit here is taking the steps 4 through 8 together and instruct on steps 9 through 12. We see the sponsor share shortcomings. We see this loosely documented in stories and instructional material. It's just more prominent in Oxford group literature than it is in AA literature, but it is in AA instructional material specifically. It's from the Akron Guide to the Steps, where we can see that. We see inventory, share story, discussion. This is a process, this isn't someone coming to you with a written inventory. This is you sitting down with them and discussing those shortcomings or character defects, and maybe writing something down, maybe not writing something down. And this would lead to, that conviction and conversion that we talked about from the 5 C's. So it would lead to that surrender, that you would take this with them. Dr. Bob would pray immediately, on their knees after the sponsee said they were ready to surrender, he was praying not only for them but for himself as well. And then they would sit down and make the amends list and plan out how they were going to make that amends, and all those amends. And so they would do that. This is all one sitting. They would also share the importance of quiet time, and they would also share the importance of working with others. So this is really what it looked like. And this is where it starts to get murky here, when we look at active work as, yeah, commence the AA way of life together, because sponsorship, that was kind of it, that was it. And then they would be meeting together regularly. It's sometimes up to 6 days a week. They were meeting together in Akron, and they were co-sponsoring new prospects together. They were practicing quiet time together. They were checking and living by principles together. But they weren't meeting up with a sponsor every week. It wasn't so formal. So that's what it looked like, what we could call sponsorship with quotes around it in early AA, but that term was not there. It meant the sponsor in early AA meant who's going to pay the hospital bill because we don't trust alcoholics coming in here. So I'll pause there. Justin, is there any questions or anything you want to add?
Yeah, a real quick question. I was going to save this to the end, but I think this is a good time to jump in here with it. As you're looking back at all these things, doing this research on the founders, on the early days, on the actions of these individuals, and as you've mentioned, hey, there are some things that are a little bit loose. You said, hey, Bill didn't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Um, does that knowledge in your own recovery walk, or does that information like make you less of a, I don't know, of a believer, to put it that way, in
Hmm.
this recovery way of life, or does that does that affect you in any way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yeah, I think what I've heard, like, yeah, through this research, right, I see the humanness, right? Because it's on when we think about just these AA myths, right? It seems so, oh, divine and like, divine providence, these two things had to occur this way. And we still see that when we look at this stuff, right? Is that, if this event didn't happen, we wouldn't have AA today. I think what this helps me with, in my own personal recovery walk, is that it makes me more, I think, less so rigid and like, hey, there was a right way to do this. And if I don't do it that way, then I'm not going to stay sober. I'm not going to be happy. And it really frees me up to know that, hey, they really didn't know what they were doing. They had some stuff, the vast majority of stuff passed down from the Oxford group. They knew that stuff worked, but they were really testing it out. And it shows the camaraderie they had and their dependence and faith upon God and upon each other. And to me, that actually strengthens me. I think it's helpful to have that, humanity, to see, oh, here's where Bill lied, and things like that. And it just makes, it makes those people more, more human and less, less godlike to me. And it makes it, oh, okay, this could have been me. It could have been, a couple of guys, with 4 years sober, two guys with 3 or 4 years sober sitting around writing this book, hoping that it would help some people and hoping that they were going to make a lot of money on it, And so,
Right.
it just shows, yeah, I get being there at 3 or 4 years sober.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that too, because as I've thought about this, both in recovery, in my faith walk or anything like that, those humans from the past who were trying their best to connect with the God of their understanding and do God's will, were human just like me. And if someone like that can do something that can change an individual, or make a movement happen, why can't God do that through me? Not that I'm looking to do that, but it makes me, gives me hope, I think.
Yeah,
So yeah, thank you.
yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to the next common practice that we find in early AA and in the Oxford group. And I would say, it's interesting here when we talk about fellowship. It's such a big deal in 12-step fellowships today. I mean, it's called fellowship, but the actual activity of fellowshipping, it really seems that it was much more important to early AA than it was to the Oxford group. So when we think about the Oxford group, we have to remember it wasn't always called the Oxford group. It started out as a first century Christian fellowship, um, and in the early 20th century, and it was really a fellowship of surrendered people. It was similar to early AA in that they had a way of life that they were practicing, and because of that, they were able to fellowship with each other, right? And that's what it was in early AA. They had a program or some loose instructions, and loose guidelines on what they were practicing, and that brought them into fellowship with other people. And so here's some quotes. This is the first one is from For Sinners Only, which some people have called in the past the Oxford Group basic text. So it says they were not an organization, for there was no membership, not a sect, for they were interdenominational, not really a new movement, for they were but a continuation of early Christian fellowship, not a church, but aiming at an inner spiritual fellowship in all churches. And then from the 8 points of the Oxford Group, it says one of the greatest things the Oxford Group movement is doing is to make fellowship possible. Everywhere there are these happy people who have come into the camaraderie of a world adventure. So it wasn't so much of, hey, you need fellowship. It's when I was looking through Oxford Group literature and I looked, just looked for the word fellowship, there's 100 instances of fellowship in Christ, but when we talk about fellowship with other surrendered members, or any other members, that there weren't really many references I could find. And early AA took some of this and they saw that they needed each other more maybe than the Oxford Group members did. And so what we see is that actually conflicting reports, and some of this might have to do with time, um, and some of this might have to do with, just location as well. And so yeah, so early again, fellowship of surrendered people program came first, and then you would get into the fellowship. And in many cases, you couldn't attend your first meeting until you've taken all of the steps, or if you've gone through at least and surrendered, and have started amends. And so, this is from Glenn Chestnut's book. It's called the AA Meetings from 1938 to 1942 in Akron and Cleveland. You should be able to find that online. And if you're not, you can email me. In early Akron AA, members were expected to show up every day, 6 days a week at Dr. Bob's house. And he breaks this down into 3 different things, and we'll get into those as well. And here's something interesting. So when early I reached out to John Rockefeller Jr., he sent his friend Frank Amos to go find out what's this AA thing about. And Frank Amos came back to him in 1937 with a report. And in this report, he had 8 points or 7 points that the Akron alcoholics were practicing. And it's interesting that at the bottom of the list, and it says it's important, and then it says, but not vital, that he meet frequently with other reformed alcoholics and form both a social and religious camaraderie. So they didn't think that meetings were mandatory to recovery. They did think that their morning quiet time was. And then we see, and this is from an account that was recorded in February of 1937, of a member in early AA saying that the surrender was more than important. It was a must. They demanded it. You couldn't go to a meeting until you did it. And so it's just the dynamic was very different of, whereas now most people either through treatment or they show up to a meeting because there's so many meetings, they show up and they can decide, do I want this program or not, and a lot of members, you don't know how many of the people in each meeting, how many of them have taken this program. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying how it's different than early AA. So that's what we see about fellowship and the importance of fellowship in early AA. They did do these things together. They did meet 6 days a week. They were, going through this flying blind period, trying to understand how they were sober and what they could do to help other people stay sober. All right, so this is one aspect I was excited to cover as I found this was principled living, because it's talked about in our 12 steps, right? Practice these principles in all our affairs, and then the question arises, what principles? And some people might say, well, the 12 steps, and I guess someone could argue that those are principles, but early AAs and the Oxford group were much more objective than that. And so we'll start with principled living in the Oxford group. And this is, if there's one teaching that we can absolutely say the Oxford group was about, it's the four absolutes or the four standards. And they're the principles that they strive to live their lives in accordance to. They knew that they were going to fall short, and they were okay with that. It just in striving that they were able, to come close, that they were able to grow. Um, and so I will say that the four absolutes have gotten a bad reputation in AA, and it's often said that Bill had to get away from these oppressive Oxford group, teachings, and yeah, there's just, Bill's written a letter, and there's plenty of other, talks that he gave. But I'll quote from a talk in 1941 on or a letter from 1941 in the next slide of what he thought about the absolutes. He says, again, in the AA history, don't believe everything you hear or say. But as for the Oxford group, so yeah, here's a quote that they have 4 points, which are the keys to the kind of spiritual life God wishes us to lead. And for them, that was that absolute love, absolute purity, absolute honesty, and absolute unselfishness. And here's an interesting thing, people often say, the Oxford group, they were trying to be perfect, and that's why Bill had to get away. And it's interesting when we look at their literature. Here's a good quote that neither in this respect is there any absolute perfection on earth. There is no perfection which does not admit of continual increase. The only person who cannot be absolutely perfect is he who claims to be. Humility is essential to perfection. And there's another analogy in some Oxford group literature. If a kid gets 100 on a math test, is he a perfect mathematician? No, but did he do perfectly on that test? Yes. And so that's a similar way to perfection of how they thought about the absolute nature of these standards. Now, these followed into early AA. And early AA, they always sought to live up to some principles. It started with the four standards. And Glenn Chestnut, he's done some good work tracing how it went into, looking at 1 Corinthians 13, the principles of love there, and then later into the St. Francis prayer. But I'm going to focus specifically on the four standards as they show up in early AA from 1935 to 39. But what stuck out to me was that there was always a set of principles, right? It wasn't just, there was no question about what the principles were. That to each individual, they knew that they were striving for some set of principles. That I don't really see this much. Like I think it's not as objective as it was to them. Whereas we can definitely, we've seen those placards that say, here's the principle for each step. And that doesn't come from any AA literature, but that's helpful. But yeah, if you just walked up to a random 12-step member and said, hey, what principles are you trying to live your life by, you get a lot of different things. And in some cases, you might not get any. And so this was a very important facet of their program. So here's a quote from Dr. Bob's last major talk in 1948. He said, the four absolutes, as we called them, were the only yardsticks we had in the early days before the steps. I think the absolutes still hold good and can be extremely helpful. I found at times that a question arises and I want to do the right thing, but the answer is not obvious. Almost always, if I measure my decision carefully by the yardsticks of absolute honesty, unselfishness, purity, and love, and it checks up pretty well with these four, then my answer can't be very far out of the way. I'm going to skip down to the third bullet here and just share. So this is from the first version of Fitzmayo's story, Me and John. And it provides a glimpse of what he's approached by two AAs while he's in Towns Hospital. And he asked him, what's this AA program? And it says, the man asked, would you be willing to live on a new basis to try to live up to ideals by trying to be absolutely honest, pure, unselfish, and loving in all your relationships with your fellow man to get rid of your drink problem? Of course I would, I declared without much thought. I'd do anything. Then all of your troubles are over, said the man, and he left the room. And that was the whole program that AA gave Fitzmayo. But if you look at the edition that's in print in your big books, you'll notice that the man would say, are you willing to make an inventory? Are you willing to confess? Are you willing to make amends? And it's interesting, and this is what I was talking about before, of how drastically that's changed, right? And it goes to show at the time of the first writing of the story, that is what was the most important thing that Fitzmayo thought of the AA program. And yeah, now I'll share from this 1940 letter that Bill wrote. Someone had reached out to him and asked, why did AA leave the Oxford group? Also, it should be noted, the Oxford group, it used to be First Century Christian Fellowship. Then it changed to the Oxford group. And then in 39, it went on an entirely different basis and became the Moral Rearmament, the MRA. And then I believe it was 91 is when they changed to the Initiatives for Change. And the Initiatives for Change is still around. So you'll often hear, the Oxford group is no more because they didn't have a primary purpose or, whatever myth. But they did change their purpose and they did change their name. So yeah, the Initiatives for Change are still around, but it's not anything like the Oxford group was up until 1939. And so and Bill had to distance AA from the Oxford group just as the Oxford group changed to the Moral Rearmament, because their primary purpose changed from helping people get in touch with God and to live God-centered lives, and to see what was God's plan for their lives, and it changed to helping nations. And so it very much changed. But this is what Bill had to say. He said, the principles of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love are as much of a goal for AA members and are as much practiced by them as by any other group of people. Yet we have found that when the word absolute was put in front of these attributes, they either turned people away by the hundreds or gave a temporary spiritual inflation, leading in collapse. And you can find a copy of this letter, and he goes through, I think, 8 points of what he didn't like about the Oxford group. Some of those we'll cover later as well. But it shows you that the problem was not with the 4 principles. The problem Bill had was with the word absolute in front of them. And so, and you do see in Oxford group literature, it's not always seen as the 4 standards. It's 4 absolutes. Sometimes it's the 4 standards. And so, what this means to me is that, hey, these are still good principles to strive for, that maybe we should have the courage to strive for them and the grace to fall short, and accept that we're going to fall short. But we can see that they were very important in early AA. And at least to have any set of principles was extremely important. So this one kind of leads right into the next one. And in fact, I'll use some of the same quotes. So the Oxford group, they advocated for self-examination, or they might call it checking. And it was checking your own conduct, word, deed, and thought against the principles for which they strived. And they did this on an individual daily basis. And that's where, regular inventory comes from. And they did this with others on a regular basis. In fact, like the earliest, your first confession was oftentimes, there's accounts, and find this in your own material. I don't have this sourced here, where they would fold up a piece of paper twice into quarters, and they would just write one of the absolutes on each corner, and then they would see, and how far have I strayed in each of these absolutes. And that was the kind of the 4th step idea. And then it became on a daily basis, where am I falling short of these, and how can I, where did I strive and successfully hit these? So, all right, so this is from the 8 points. The practice of regular self-examination in the light of Christ has proved to be of genuine practical value in our Christian development. So regular self-examination. And And again, just a couple pages later, the group insists on the indispensable necessity of daily checking, that we are absolutely yielded to love in thought, word, and deed. Now, this is from I Was a Pagan is a book by Victor Kitchen, and he knew Bill and Dr. Bob, and he got sober in the Oxford group and stayed in the Oxford group. And there was a good number of alcoholics who stayed back in the Oxford group when AA split off. But this is again a good book to get a more story account of the Oxford group. So instead, in other words, of criticizing each other, we now criticize ourselves to each other and ask the other's prayers about it. And when we occasionally do check to hold other to the maximum in Christ, it is not without first examining the beam in our own eye and then only under guidance in a prayerful and redemptive way. So we do see, this ideal of if I'm going to check somebody else, if I'm going to say, hey, that's not really loving, or that's not, that doesn't sound honest, that there was some preparation done on our part first, before we take someone else's inventory. And it's interesting to see how this came into AA. And then the last one is from For Sinners Only. And this is also more of a story account. But before I committed myself, I checked it with and this is actually someone talking about whether or not they should get married to their current wife. And this is how important it was to check all their decisions. They said, before I committed myself, I checked it with my friends, as people in the group are wisely accustomed to do. Their guidance confirmed my own. And so this isn't referring to just, hey, is this, is this loving? Is this honest? Is this unselfish? Is this pure? Their guidance confirmed my own as the guidance they received in prayer and meditation. And then you would ask your other group members to ask for guidance on the specific matter and see what they got about it. And their guidance confirmed his own guidance that he should be married to who he had in mind.
That's a huge thing in my own guidance practice, my own two-way prayer practice, is making sure I have a prayer partner or two that I share those things with to keep me from my own blind spots, who check on me and say, hey, no, there's some selfishness in there. Let's take a look at that one again, and I think that's vital.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it was, well, we'll cover this a lot in guidance, but it was first, check what we write down with the four absolutes. And then if it's still unsure, let's check it with somebody else. But before making any major decisions, don't just go off your guidance. And you really see this start to affect AA when the story I've heard is, and check this, but the story I heard was that Henrietta Sieberling, she started receiving guidance that Bill Wilson was the devil in the 50s, and she was going around and telling everybody how he was the devil, and that how AA had gone astray and that they were doing it right back in Akron, and the Oxford group was right. And then all of a sudden in the 12 and 12, you see all these additions. There's only one warning about checking your guidance really in the big book, but in the 12 and 12, we see it on 3 or 4 different, full paragraphs about checking guidance. But yeah, it's always important. All right, so the early AAs continue the practice of checking themselves on a regular basis, checking themselves with others, and unfortunately checking others, and that's a practice we get the most criticism in these documents about. So it's the same quote earlier from Dr. Bob's talk. He said, almost always, if I measure my decision carefully by the yardsticks of the four absolutes. So he was measuring his decisions. He was checking himself. And then we see, this is from the Glenn Chestnut book, that where we said that they were expected to show up 6 days a week. So, and specifically in the evening, when everyone would sit around in the kitchen or living room and talk about any problems they had during the day. And so they're checking this, with other people, or an AA member could drop by Dr. Bob's office at any time during the day and talk with him one-on-one there. They're checking their own conduct, they're trying to live the principled lives, that they are, and they're checking in order to make sure they stay on the beam. And so here's from that same 1940 letter from Bill. Actually, I'll read the next one first. So from the vicious cycle from, I think that's Jim Burwell's story. It says, in those days, we really took each other's inventories firmly and often. So they continue to check each other. And this was Bill's criticism of the Oxford group. It was discovered that all forms of coercion, both direct and indirect, had to be dropped. We found that checking in the hands of amateurs too often resulted in criticism, and that resulted in resentment, which is probably the most serious problem the average alcoholic is troubled with. Um, I've heard an account before of that Oxford group members or early AA members would go into each other's homes, into their bathrooms, and see where they would have their upper room daily reader and check what page it was on to make sure that the member was current, and that's another level, of accountability. And essentially, the takeaway here, is that Bill said, one with the absolutes, right, is that let's not hold them absolute. Let's not, hold ourselves to that high of a degree. Let's just, let's strive for them and know that we're going to fall short. And then with checking, let's just check ourselves. Let's stop checking other people without, getting their privilege to do that.
Yeah, that sounds a little big brotherish, checking in on everything. And it totally goes against the principle of, teaching or learning correct principles and then trying to govern yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And we can say, maybe it was coming from a place of fear, or maybe it was coming from a place of superiority. We never know. But I'm glad that we found that Bill said, hey, we've got to cut this out. And, um, yeah, at least it's not, nobody's dropping by my home and checking what day my daily reader is on.
Yeah, thank goodness.
All right. So this I do think is the most important practice, and I'm not saying that, based on my personal opinion, but based in the literature that points to it, was this daily quiet time. And there was one quote that I couldn't get in time for this presentation, but the quote is something like, the Oxford group thought, we had to have quiet time every morning. 1 hour was good, 2 hours was better. So they're very serious about this time that they're spending. And we see the quiet time and guidance appear in pretty much all of the Oxford group literature. It's second only to the four standards. Um, so yeah, the daily quiet time for Oxford groupers occurred each morning and each meeting that they would have. So if a Oxford group house party came to your town, often the people who were changed from that house party would start their own groups, and they would hold that weekly group, and the group would start with the quiet time. The meeting would start with prayer and meditation, not just reciting one prayer together, but spending a considerable amount of time there. Um, so let's see, this is from What is the Oxford Group? The quiet time with the Holy Spirit every morning before the daily toil and common round of the world commences will put us in the right key for the day. And this is from the 8 points. One of the most valuable features of the group technique is the quiet time. Each member is urged to devote some time in the early morning to quietness, creating in the silence an atmosphere where one can be susceptible to divine guidance and sensitive to the sway of the Spirit. And I've seen some accounts, I think it's in the What is the Oxford Group, that says, hey, just start with 15 minutes each day. And then I've seen those accounts of, hey, 1 hour is good, 2 hours is better. And I could have listed endless quotes, but they're all saying the same thing in Oxford group literature of how important that daily quiet time is for the surrendered person. And this was pivotal in early AA. It was mandatory to recovery. So this is from Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. This is Bill recounting what him and Ann were doing, and Dr. Bob, each morning there was a devotion. After a long silence in which they awaited inspiration and guidance, Ann would read from the Bible. And Henrietta Dotson, wife of A, number 3, remembered that Ann would call her every single morning and ask me if I had my quiet time. She did that for a year, every single morning, just to, hey, did you have your quiet time yet? And then again, this is from the Frank Amos report. So we saw it was vital, but not, or it was optional for meeting attendance, and have vital to have a camaraderie with other people. But it's very specific in the language about quiet time. They use the word mandatory in the report, and they say he must have devotions every morning, a quiet time of prayer, and some reading from the Bible and other religious literature. Unless this is faithfully followed, there's grave danger of backsliding. So, and it's interesting. The next account, Bill is talking about how there's another guy who and his wife who were sobering up drunks. And so he says, so Duke P started, they stressed morning time, daily reading, and daily contact. They also told me to do something about my alcoholism every day. So Duke is talking about that. Um, and Duke remembered taking a poll of slippers in the early 1940s and finding that they had all stopped having their morning quiet time. And actually, this is what I was referring to. Bill found it odd that Wally and Annabelle G had helped sober up a lot more people, and Lois and Anne didn't have that many successes. The treatment was the same, except the G's morning hour of meditation. And Bill said, I sort of always felt that something was lost from AA when we stopped emphasizing the morning meditation. And we have to remember the definition we have of meditation today, which is often focusing on your breath, the clearing of thoughts from your mind. That definition was not in the U.S. until the 1960s, so it's not the definition they had. When we look at dictionaries from, I think it's 1931, it says, reflection, the musing of a topic on the mind, and Clarence Snyder, he said later, like if you've worried before, you know how to meditate. You just meditated on something negative. Why don't you meditate on something positive, right? Continued thought, that's what meditation meant to them. And so this time, what's interesting is we see how important this was in early AA, that we see that many people thought that it was the most important thing, and it was often the missing ingredient. And we also know that Bill Wilson and Lois continued to do it for the rest of their lives, and so did Dr. Bob and Ann Smith. And we can see I added this extra slide to give it a little more detail, that daily quiet time for Oxford groupers and early AA consisted of prayer, reading, silence, and guidance, that those were kind of four common elements. It might look different for each individual person, but Dr. Bob says his morning devotion consisted of a short prayer, a 20-minute study of a familiar verse from the Bible, and a quiet period of waiting for directions as to where he that day should find use for his talent. There's another account that says Dr. Bob, he would get his guidance, and that Dr. Bob wouldn't write his down, and he would just go out with his orders for the day and begin working on them. And then we'd see in the Oxford group at the beginning of each day, before we come into contact with others, it is possible to have the mind illumined by unhurried reading of the Bible, by prayer and waiting upon God for guidance. And the early AAs continued in the Oxford group tradition of using the Bible, as well as they found the Upper Room, which started being published in 1939, and then the Sermon on the Mount by Emmett Fox. And their favorite passages in the Bible were the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and the book of James. And these were just what they would like to read, and those were very useful in helping them receive guidance in the day and to live up to the type of lives they were trying to live. But we see that it's just interesting, that this was one of the most important things. And, they'd be asking each other, did you have your quiet time? Yeah, what guidance did you get? That kind of thing. So here's, we'll go into this last part. It's the guidance, which is specifically just some more information regarding that last part of quiet time. So receiving guidance from God is a key practice of the Oxford group. We see it in the four practical spiritual activities: that listening to, accepting, relying on God's guidance, and carrying it out in everything we do or say, great or small. And the Oxford group advocates our use of a pencil and notebook so that we may record every God-given thought. It is not suggested that everything we write down during our quiet times necessarily comes from God. In cases of difficulty, our guidance can be checked up with the teaching of the Bible, or by conference with others who are also receiving guidance in quiet time. And then we see the group strongly recommends the keeping of a guidance book wherein we write the inspired thoughts that come in waiting. Definite daily guidance is available to us. And yeah, and then this is Victor Kitchen about his first thought of guidance that came after he's done this Oxford group house party. I had actually started for a bottle in the pantry when God stopped me with my first real bit of guidance and told me that I could not serve him as long as I was a slave to gin. So we definitely see that, one, that there was some preparation before receiving guidance, and then they would verify it by checking it up with the Bible, the four absolutes, and then with other people in times where it was questionable. And we see this in early AA as well. I've already read that first quote of receiving guidance. Here's a good one. This is kind of, I try to paste this story, and so this is Henrietta saying, this is before Dr. Bob got sober. She was sitting in quiet time and she asked God, what are we going to do about Bob? And she said, I knew that wasn't my thought. So I called Bob and told him I had guidance for him. This is very important, I said. He came over at 10 in the morning and I told him that my guidance was that he mustn't touch one drop of alcohol. He was very disappointed because he thought guidance would mean seeing somebody or going someplace instead of joining the merrymakers at the bar. Okay. Yeah. So, often your guidance would be who to make restitution to, where to go, who to talk to. And Dr. Bob was disappointed. But she got this guidance, it's very important you stop. And Dr. Bob is pretty much, yeah, I already know that, it's how are we going to get there? And so this is where the story connects. Instead of so this is Bill in Akron. He's having trouble. He feels he's going to drink and he's in the Mayflower Hotel. And instead of joining the merrymakers at the bar, Bill got the guidance to look at the minister's directory in the lobby. And through that, and I think he goes through 3 contacts until he gets to Henrietta, and Henrietta connects him with Dr. Bob. And so those 2 pieces of guidance come together to change Bill and Dr. Bob's life and start AA and all the 12-step fellowships we have today. So here's something from Dr. Bob and the good old timers. This is a guy named Ernie, was saying that the guidance things the groupers had never went down well with the drunks. Maybe it wasn't well explained or explained thoroughly enough. It didn't strike me right from the beginning. He said, it seemed to be getting a little too technical and detailed. Sometimes I felt like we were using a Ouija board. Me and some of the other alkies felt they put these things down on paper and it was their own personal idea for you. But out of respect for T. Henry, which is T. Henry and Clarice Williams, is where they were having the Oxford group meeting every Wednesday night. They say we didn't kick too much. So it sounds like the problem that Ernie had was not so much with the guidance, it was that people getting, guidance for other people, and so this is the thing that Bill warns against and everything, yeah, it's just for ourselves, because Henrietta was getting guidance later that Bill was the devil, and so we're not getting guidance for other people and telling them what they need to do with their lives. Hey, God is telling me this, that you need to do this for your life. And that's what it's interesting that Bill said in that letter about separating from the Oxford group. So while most of us believe profoundly in the principle of guidance, it was soon apparent that to receive it accurately, considerable spiritual preparation was necessary. And that may mean, that it's the last part of your quiet time practice. It may mean that, you've been living a surrendered life and that you've changed, you've made amends, that kind of thing. Could mean both, it could mean going through the steps or whatever practices that were being utilized at the time. And then practicing daily quiet time, and at the end of it, receiving guidance and still checking. Now, another cool thing about this practice is that this is how Bill used or how he wrote the steps. And another word for guidance, specifically how guidance is received, is called automatic writing. And Bill talks about how he wrote the steps. He said, as he started to write, he asked for guidance and he relaxed. The words began tumbling out with astonishing speed. And then, later, Bill and Lois themselves, however, continued the practice of quiet time together until his death in 1971. So quiet time and guidance were very important to the founders of AA, and to early AA. And we have one account that Ernie says they didn't really get it there. And we actually see that Clarence in Cleveland doesn't really talk much about guidance, but he continues the practice of quiet time. And in the literature that he wrote, and later in the Came to Believe recovery guides, that the literature that he helped with, it's almost non-existent there. And one theory on this is that so Cleveland broke away from the Oxford group. He tried to go to Dr. Bob and say, hey, we need to get away from the Oxford group. I have 7, 8 Catholic guys here who can't come to the Oxford group meetings, but they're all drunks and they want help. And Dr. Bob says, well, I don't know what to do. And Clarence says, well, I do. We're going to break off. We're going to separate from the Oxford group. And so it's possible that, maybe this practice is not as much of a Catholic practice, such as the long inventories that we often see, like in the big book, making that into a long inventory of doing it for months. That's more of a Catholic practice of the time, is where Glen C references where that came from. But it was not as much of an Oxford group practice. So yeah, this is actually the last topic, but I'll say, where do we see like what happened to guidance? Why aren't people talking about guidance? Why isn't it AA literature? Well, it is in AA literature, but if we don't have this contextual information, we're probably not going to see it, So on awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. We consider our plans for the day, but before we consider our plans, we ask God to direct our thinking. And thinking about our day, we may face indecision. We may not be able to determine which course to take. Here we ask God for inspiration and intuitive thought or decision. We relax and take it easy. We are often surprised how the right answers come after we have tried this for a while. And he goes on and gives a warning too. Hey, we're inexperienced. We might, it's probable, it's not probable we're going to be inspired at all times. We might pay for this presumption. But nevertheless, we'll find that our thinking will, as time passes, be more and more on the plane of inspiration. And it says, ask God in your morning meditation what you can do each day for the man who is still sick. The answers will come. So it is asking for guidance, and it is relax and take it easy. And then it says receive. And it does say, even about, hey, there's helpful readings that we can do before. We try to do some meditation, some prayer before we do this. But they did talk about receiving guidance for the day in the morning. The big book also talks about guidance throughout the day, right? Ask for the right thought or action. Whenever we got to pause and then ask for the right thought or action. Well, we're not asking ourselves. And then we can see how the Oxford group influenced AA, where they would take all of their problems, they wouldn't go directly to each other. They'd take it into quiet time and ask God, what do we want to do about each specific matter? And that was Oxford group, and it made it into the big book, in the section on the sex inventory. In other words, we treat sex as we would any other problem. So how are we treating every problem? In meditation, we ask God what we should do about each specific matter. The right answer will come if we want it. And like I said, in the 12 and 12, we see a lot of warnings about making sure you check your guidance. And here's one of them: is it is worth noting that people of very high spiritual development almost always insist on checking with friends or spiritual advisors the guidance they feel they have received from God. And that's from the 12 and 12. And we also see in the big book, ask your wife, ask your partner to join you, that they would do their quiet times together. They would get their guidance, they might do the readings together. They would get their own individual guidance and they would share and check it with each other. So I just want to sum up, the 6 practices that we talked about were specifically sponsorship with quotes around it, but it was really helping other people, helping change lives. It was fellowship. It was living by principles, checking out our conduct and trying to live by these principles, and quiet time, daily quiet time, and guidance daily in our quiet time, as well as later on throughout the day when we needed guidance on specific situations. And we can see all 6 of these practices observed in early AA literature, and as well as heavily documented in the Oxford group. So yeah, that's what I had prepared I'll leave my contact info here as well on the screen. It's aahistorynerd@gmail.com. And yeah, I'm going to stop sharing. And then, yeah, Justin, feel free to if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sid. I really appreciate that. One of the questions that kept coming up in my mind was, how has this information changed the way that you work your own recovery with yourself and with others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, part of my journey of why I got into this history business was because I was a big book thumper and I was convinced I was doing it the right way. And anyone working the steps out of the 12 and 12 was wrong. And if you're doing worksheets, then you're definitely wrong. And I was starting to get exposed to AA history that was proving me wrong. And so I started to find, I said, let me find out the right way. Let me find out how they really did it. And to my astonishment, what I found was that there was no right way. That early AA, they did not they did not have one right way. They were trying to figure it out. And what the program looked like in Akron and Cleveland and New York was all very different. And there were some similarities, but they were very different. And the big book came, directly out of New York by Bill and Hank Parkhurst, were the primary authors of the big book. And there was no input from Akron. It's often said, how they would pass it around, and there's editing that happened when they got to the multi-lith edition, but there was no there's even a letter from Bill asking Dr. Bob, hey, I've asked you nicely, please, can you give me some criticism? You're not giving me anything. So it was really Bill, trying to bridge the gap between New York and Akron and say, well, here's some commonalities in what we do. Um, but yeah, I think what's helped me is, okay, well, there was no right way, and so, well, what's the best way? What had the most success rate? And well, it turns out that we can't accurately measure that at all either. What we can say, what I have learned from this, I think part of it is that there is no right way, that it was individual to the person and to the city that they were in. What I do see is that these 6 practices were very important, and it shows me that, to me at least, with the guys that I sponsor, it's not so much about how am I going to get them through the steps and make them have an experience and start sponsoring others. And you know it's more about, yeah, like just exposing them to the whole AA experiment, which for me I used to think was, oh, you take the steps, and through taking the steps, the spiritual experience happens right at the end. And part of the AA experiment, at least for Dr. Bob and Akron and in New York, Sam Shoemaker from the Oxford group called it the experiment of faith, or the hypothesis of faith. It didn't matter what you believed, it mattered what you did. Like act as if you believe, live a life, surrendered life, and see what happens. And that, to me, is I should be practicing daily quiet time and see what happens. And so I have changed my approach in sponsorship to kind of fit more in line with the approach that I shared here today. And what I've found is that the same people who aren't going to write their own 4th step, you can write it for them, but they're probably not going to go out and make amends. They're probably not going to practice daily quiet time every day for 30 days. And to me, and the thing is, like, I can't make that happen for anybody. I don't have the power to help them gain that conviction, to have that conversion experience. That's God's job, not mine. Like, I can only pass it on, and stick with them and walk through them in this way of life. And to me, what's changed with this research, as well as becoming less rigid, is becoming more of, we're walking this together, shoulder to shoulder. It's not, hey, I'm here to teach you the right way, and then you can pass it on to other. It's, hey, look, these practices are exactly the same thing I'm doing. I'm inviting you to join me in doing these and see what happens in your life if it's the same thing that happened in mine. So I think that's kind of how I would answer that question.
Thank you. And I love that concept of, and I've heard this said many times in the rooms. Hey, I seek out somebody who has what you want, ask them what they're doing, and do what they're doing, and see if it works for you. And I think that's the concept that you just shared there. Do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
No, I think, yeah, you said it right. Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add, right, is that like the emphasis was on the sponsor, not the sponsee. So it's not my job to wait, for someone to come up to me and say, "Hey, I want what you have. Can you show me what you're doing?" They're probably not going to know to do that. It's my job to find new people and invite them into this way of life, and to walk them through it and show them that I'm doing that as well, which means sharing my struggles with them, which means, showing them how I'm trying to live a principled life and how I'm falling short, and, inviting them to do quiet time with me. Not just saying, "Oh, if you were willing, you'd do this stuff." It's no, I'm gonna, let's do it together. And it's okay, it's okay to have doubt, and it's okay to not be willing. Let's find, let's just test it out and see. I always say, hey, just try this experiment for 30 days. Like, we go through the first 2 visits. You start making amends, practice quiet time for 30 days. Come with me to help take another guy through the steps. If you're not satisfied in 30 days, like, if a change hasn't happened by doing that, that's fine. Like, let's find someone who's going to be able to help you in a way that I can't, because I'm not going to, there's no right way. So I can't even say that this is the best way to do it.
And when you said, "Hey, practice quiet time with me," what does that look like to you? Is that, "Hey, I'm sitting down with you every morning, whether it'll be over the phone or in person or over Zoom, and doing this together," or just checking with each other on our quiet time practice?
Yeah, it can be both. I had a group that was running for about 6 months, where it was me and a couple of my sponsees who would meet. And this is back about 2 years ago, where we would meet every morning and we would do the entire quiet time together. So we'd sit on the Zoom call from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. and we would go through reading the same thing, doing our individual prayer, and then, taking our own time to ask God for guidance and then share that guidance with each other. And then we would go out into the day. I've also done it in ways of where we just send the guidance to each other. I've done it in ways of where, once a week when we meet, let's just go over any notable guidance or any guidance that you fell short of, or, things like that. But I've just found it extremely helpful to sit down and do the whole practice together, if we're able to, just because there's nothing like it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sid. Before we close out, are there any other final words of wisdom or any wrap up that you want to do?
No, no, no words of wisdom here. I just want to say, if anyone wants to talk with me about my personal journey, about this AA history work, you can reach me at AA history lover or AA history nerd at gmail.com. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want the sources or any documents, or the link to this presentation or anything, you can just email me as well. And I'm happy to email you the PDFs that I have, as well as point you in the direction of any books that you can acquire. So yeah, I'm just happy to be helpful in any way that I can. So yeah, thanks for having me on here, Justin, and allowing me to share some of this information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sid. We'll talk soon. Well, there you have it. That was Sid, and that was some pretty good stuff. I hope you got a lot out of it. I got a ton out of it when I was sitting down just listening and watching that with him as he shared that live with me. And I'm grateful that he did that. Thank you again, Sid. So, starting next week, which will be the month of December, we're going to do a really cool thing during the month of December. And I'm going to give you a little background on that before closing this out. So, before starting the RICO 12 weekly speaker meeting podcast in 2020, on June 19th of 2020, it was my sobriety date anniversary. I did a previous podcast called Journey Through Life. And the premise of that podcast was ordinary people with extraordinary stories. Well, come around close to the end of 2019, my higher power kept kind of nudging me and saying, "Hey, Justin, you need to do a series on the 12 steps of recovery in your podcast." And this podcast was not about addiction. It was not about recovery. It was about real life stories. And some of them did touch on addiction and on recovery, but mostly it was just about people sharing their stories, leaving a legacy for those who come behind them. Anyways, so in my little community of recovery that I had at that time, I started reaching out to some of my sponsees, sponsors, other people that I had met in recovery and said, hey, I'm going to do a 12-week series on each of the 12 steps. Do you have anybody in your recovery network that you think would be a really good speaker on step 1 or step 4 or whatever step, each of the 12 steps? And through that process, I was introduced to some of the people that have radically shifted my own recovery walk. Most of these people also were later speakers on RICO 12. Some of them were not, but most of them were. And the concepts that I learned as they shared their stories, their experience, their strength, their hope, just changed things up. Anyways, after I finished that series on each of the 12 steps, I went back to doing Journey Through Life the way it had been done before, and it felt empty. And my higher power, my God, kept saying, hey, Justin, you need to go and do some recovery podcasting. And so I spent some time thinking and praying and pondering and taking notes and writing, and RICO 12 was what came to my mind. And this project and how it's set up is what came to my mind and what came to be. So through the month of December, I'm going to re-release, with a little bit of editing, the previous podcast, the Journey Through Life podcast, on each of the 12 steps of recovery. Now, there will be a few podcasts released each week because there were some steps that I had more than one speaker on, and some that I had to split into 2 weeks because there was just so much. So anyways, I'm real excited to do that. So next Friday, we will be learning about step 1 from Shannon T., who is an Al-Anon who just knocked it out of the park. There was no better person that I could get to start off this process. She was real, she was honest, she was healthy, and just loved it. So next week on Friday, we'll hear from Shannon T. on step 1. And then on Saturday, I'm going to release the first part of step 2 with Harvey E., who has been a speaker on RICO 12 a couple of times. And he has a 2-part thing on step 2. And his concept of step 2 shifted my entire trajectory of my recovery. So anyways, I'm excited for these things. We'll get started on that. Now, as we close out this, I'm just going to close us out with my morning routine, which is the full version of the Serenity Prayer, followed by the 3rd step prayer, followed by the 7th step prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy forever with you in the next. Thy will, not mine, be done. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I am now willing that you should take from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when I work it, so work it. You are worth it.